Thank you guys for joining us today. I think we're going to get underway. My name is Amy Sterndale. I'm the Communications Director at the Carsey School of Public Policy. This is the newest school on campus, so if you haven't learned a lot about it yet, please take one of our brochures that are on the table outside and on your way out, especially if you're considering a degree in public policy. We're excited to have this event today to host Scott Nova, who is from the Workers' Rights Consortium, talking about the fight against exploitive worker conditions in sweatshops around the world. A little bit of housekeeping. Many of you signed up for the drawing for an Alta Gracia t-shirt on the way in. You're going to learn more about Alta Gracia today. We'll do the drawing at the end of the event, and you can pick the t-shirt up if you're the winner on the way out. But also, if you want to support Alta Gracia, the t-shirts here at the table are actually for sale, so consider shopping on your way out. It really is. It's a terrific story. I think you're going to enjoy learning about it today. But these shirts are for sale all the time at the Barnes & Noble bookstore in the MUB, but we asked them to come right here today, so it was really nice of them to bring them over. Don't forget to turn off your cell phones, as we all remember, or don't in my case. And we are videotaping the talk today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the director of the Carsey School of Public Policy to get us underway, Michael Ettlinger.
Thank you. I'll just say a couple of words about Carsey. We are a new school, but of course, a lot of you have heard of the Carsey Institute, which was founded in 2004 and, had a very successful run, founded as a research institute initially with, real areas of focus in vulnerable families, demographic work, community development, finance, and some other areas. Also with a small academic program with its master's degree in community development policy and practice, and with engagement activities around the state, with the signature, most prominent being the New Hampshire Listens Project. Now that we're a full school, as of about a year ago, we're going to be expanding our work in all three of those areas, broadening out our research program, and I think, of particular importance, adding a master's in public policy degree, which, we're very excited about. Sally Ward's here. She's co-chairing the committee creating it. And anyway, we're making good progress on that. I think it's going to be really an exciting program aimed at giving the skills and developing what people need to really make a difference in the world of public policy. So we're excited about that. So keep your eyes out for more information on that. So now, Cecilia Martins, you're here somewhere, from our partner organization in this event.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia Martins. I'm actually a new member to the UNH Peace and Justice League. When we heard that Scott Nova would be here today to talk about his personal experience with combating exploitative working conditions around the globe, we definitely jumped right on board to co-sponsor and help spread the word about this event. So we're happy to be here. Thank you. Our group works to host various educational events on campus of all sorts of different social issues and social injustices. This semester, our main focus has been on money and politics and the corruptive influences it has in our understanding of the U.S. as a democracy. We were just at a conference in New York, a Democracy Matters conference, and that was a gathering of chapters from all over the nation, and we're helping to understand how to organize on campus. So we came back and we started our own series of events, kind of continuation from last semester too. We had a conference just this past Saturday on money out of politics and educating people how to be active and how to ask politicians the questions that matter. We also had a documentary showing Pay to Play. And we're having next week Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's co-founder and Stamp Stampede. He's going to be here along with Vermin Supreme, March 11th at 8 p.m. So hope to see you there. Different events also we have coming up this semester is Food for Thought, and that's an opportunity for an open dialogue between students and other community members where they can talk about different concerns they have about campus, whether it be student debt or funding for UNH. So that's coming up. Stay tuned to find out when we know when. Also, at the end of this month, we're going to have a panel discussion about the conflicts in Ukraine and Russia and U.S.'s role in them. And that's something that I think faculty from UNH will be involved with, hosting and facilitating that discussion. And that's all. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay, so now I will introduce our featured performer, Scott Nova. I've known Scott a long time, and I know him very well, but we invited him anyway. Scott, I first met Scott when he was running Ocean State Action in Rhode Island, and we wrote a report that had one of my favorite titles. It was on tax policy, but it was called Deep Blues in the Ocean State. I was very proud of that title, because their tax system kind of gave you the blues. But it was actually a pretty successful report, mainly because Scott took it and ran with it and actually made a big difference in Rhode Island's tax system for a while there. So Scott then came down to Washington, and I was there. I'd been there for a number of years and did a couple of things. But for the last 14 years, he's been running the Workers' Rights Consortium, and it's sort of a fascinating organization. It was founded, actually arose out of student activism, students on university campuses who are concerned about the working conditions for those who are making university-branded apparel, T-shirts, sweatshirts that everyone wears. And it is a consortium. It's a consortium of universities that created this organization to, in fact, monitor the working conditions of those who make university-branded apparel. And it's a tough battle, as you'll hear from Scott, but it's an organization that has really made a difference. There's really no question that, but for the work of Scott and the Worker Rights Consortium, that the conditions are better in the manufacture of apparel. Particularly university-branded apparel, but it has spillover effects in the apparel industry in general, and Scott and the organization work in ways that look at the industry in general, not just specifically to that part of it that is university apparel. So Scott's a great guy, and I think you'll find what he has to say very interesting. So Scott, take it over.
Michael, thanks very much. It is true that Michael and I have worked together for a very long time. We were remarking earlier that we first worked together in 1992, which, if I recall correctly, was roughly the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Is that right, Michael? But in any case, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I went to school myself in New Hampshire, not at UNH, and I haven't been back, I think, in at least 5 years. So it's great to have an opportunity to be here, particularly during a heat wave. So I am going to talk with you today about the situation of worker rights in the garment industry. And what I want to talk with you about in particular is corporate social responsibility. And the reason I want to focus on that is because one of the greatest challenges we face in the effort to address and eliminate exploitative conditions in the industry is the success that major apparel brands and retailers have had in obfuscating the reality for workers in ways that deflect pressure for change. And corporate social responsibility is a very important stratagem that the brands use. And when I use that term, of course, what I'm talking about is the idea that corporations should behave in a responsible manner even when they may not legally be obligated to do so. And that concept is especially applicable to global corporations based in North America and Europe that produce goods in the global south, in the developing world, because the practices of those corporations, the behavior of those corporations vis-a-vis labor practices in those overseas factories are generally not subject to legal restriction, to legal obligation, because these are factories in other countries that are usually not owned by the brands and retailers themselves. Rather, they are contract factories, and so the brands and retailers are usually not legally obligated to address labor issues. And so to the extent that they do so, it is under the rubric of this concept of corporate social responsibility. And what I especially want to focus on is the gap between the rhetoric of corporate social responsibility, between the idea that corporations are indeed seeking to behave in a responsible manner, and the practical reality of their behavior in their global supply chains and the impact on workers who actually sew the garments. I'm going to stick with a particular example here in the interest of time, which is the situation of worker safety in Bangladesh. But the broader theme is applicable to every country in which apparel is produced, to every one of the labor issues that matter in the garment sector, and indeed it's applicable beyond the garment sector to other types of manufacturing, production of electronics, including smartphones and computers, production of toys, and a range of other products, because the kinds of supply chains that the major apparel brands and retailers operate are very similar now to the production systems of Apple and Toys R Us and a broad range of other consumer products companies. So, in order to understand what's gone on in Bangladesh in recent years in terms of worker safety and how it relates to the issue of corporate social responsibility, it's important to provide a little background on the garment industry and how corporate social responsibility, or CSR for short, which is an abbreviation I'm going to use, became a big issue in the industry. It's important to understand the structure of global apparel production, and I expect most people are generally aware of this, so I won't spend long on it. But in 2014, and for the last roughly 30 to 40 years, apparel brands and retailers have by and large not made apparel. They design the clothes sometimes, they market the clothes, they wholesale or retail the clothes, but the actual production is done by contract manufacturers, other businesses with whom the brands and retailers place orders in various countries around the world. And it's important to understand the nature of the relationships between the brands and retailers and the contract factories, because it is the nature of those relationships that drives the problem of abusive sweatshop conditions. First of all, the relationship is defined by short-term contracts. Brands do not make any commitment to produce at a particular factory beyond the amount of time necessary to make a particular order of clothing. So 6,000 dozen sweatshirts. Nike places an order for those sweatshirts at a factory. Factory makes the product, delivers it, Nike pays the factory, and the relationship is over. Now, Nike or any other brand or retailer may continue to place orders at that factory, may continue to do so over a period of years, but the factory has no guarantee beyond a few months. Secondly, each factory has numerous different customers. The brands and retailers do not want to represent more than a modest portion of any particular factory's production, in part to limit the obligations they have to factories and workers. So each factory has somewhere between 5 and 50 customers in the course of a year. Thirdly, there is excess capacity on the production side in the garment industry. There are more factories interested in making clothing for Nike or Walmart or Gap or any of the other players in the industry than there are orders to go around, which creates a great deal of competition. So from the standpoint of the factory owner, the ability to succeed, indeed the ability to stay in business at all, depends on the ability of the owner and its staff, his or her staff, to compete for and win an endless series of orders from a broad range of current and prospective customers in an environment in which the primary determinant for the brands and retailers of which factory to use is price. It is an environment that breeds intense competition and a great deal of economic insecurity for factories. Those factories that want to stay alive and make money have to be highly competitive on price, and they work very hard at doing that. Now, it's also important to understand that the factor of production over which the owners of the factories have the most control in terms of cost is labor. Labor is not the largest cost. The largest cost is the cloth that is sewn into garments. But the factories can't control the cost of cloth. The price is fixed. It may vary from year to year, but the factory owner doesn't control it. The factory owner doesn't control the cost of energy. The factor of production the factory owner can control to some degree is labor. And so factory owners, because they have a great incentive to find ways to reduce prices for customers, because labor is the area where they can reduce costs, have tremendous incentive to find ways to cut labor costs. Another vital factor is that the governments in the countries that export apparel to Europe and North America, by and large, do not enforce their labor laws. I won't get into great depth about why. There are two categories of reasons. One has to do with local politics, the power of factory owners in the politics of the countries. But more importantly, for our purposes, the governments understand, just as the factory owners understand, that brands and retailers are producing in places like Bangladesh and El Salvador and Swaziland exactly because it's a lot cheaper to produce there than it is to produce in the United States or Germany or the United Kingdom. And so the governments believe that the brands and retailers, whatever they may say publicly, do not in fact want them to aggressively enforce their labor laws. Indeed, they believe that if they did aggressively enforce their labor laws, let's say, for example, that Bangladesh became a bastion of strong labor unions with good collective bargaining agreements, that the response of the brands and retailers after a brief pat on the back for being so responsible will be to move production to Pakistan and India for the simple reason that it would be cheaper in an environment where there were no unions. So what you've got is this combination of two powerful dynamics. On the one hand, tremendous incentive on the part of factory owners to find any available means to cut labor costs, and a lack of law enforcement, which means that factory owners can use illegal means to cut labor costs without facing any meaningful consequences from government regulators. They can underpay relative to the minimum wage. They can force people to work overtime even when it's illegal to force people to work overtime. They can fail to invest in necessary health and safety equipment even when the law requires it, if that saves them money. And indeed, this is what happens throughout the industry, not just in Bangladesh, but around the world. Violations of labor law are the norm in the global apparel industry. The consequences are extremely low wages, virtual non-existence of functioning labor unions, harsh conditions in various ways in the workplace, and lack of attention to workplace safety. These dynamics have been enormously beneficial to the brands and retailers. This chart compares the change in prices for all products and services in the United States between 1994 and 2014 to the price of apparel. Apparel, of course, is the light blue line on the bottom. All products are the dark blue line on the top. And what you see here is that apparel prices have failed to increase at anywhere near the rate of overall inflation. There are a variety of factors here, but the single biggest factor driving this is the ability of brands and retailers to relocate apparel production to low-wage countries, and the ability of factory owners in those countries, at the behest of the brands and retailers, to find new and creative ways to exploit labor. While this has been very beneficial for the brands and retailers in terms of cost, it has created some risks. And in particular, the relevant risk for our purposes is what we call reputational risk. What is reputational risk? Quite simply, it is the risk that the reputation, the image of the brand or retailer will be damaged by public exposure of labor rights abuses in the global supply chain. Remember, in the garment industry, particularly for high-profile brands like Nike or Reebok or Gap or H&M, the image of the company is its single most valuable asset. It's not some particular shoe or clothing design, but the image of the company, because how consumers feel about the company is an extremely important driver of consumers' choices about which company's products to purchase. So there is danger to the brands that by being associated with sweatshop abuses, the image, the reputation of the brand is harmed with real consequences for the business. And indeed, beginning in the early 1990s, abusive conditions in the supply chains of major players in the industry, like Nike, like Gap, like Walmart, began to be exposed. And sustained media interest in that issue created a very serious level of reputational risk for these brands and retailers. The initial response of the brands and retailers was simply to deny responsibility for what takes place in these factories. Their position was, look, we don't own these factories. These are other businesses. We have neither the ability nor the right to seek to dictate how those other businesses operate on a day-to-day basis. And the reality is, in political terms, that excuse didn't fly. The media didn't buy it, public officials didn't buy it, the public didn't buy it. So the brands and retailers had to find a new strategy for managing their reputational risk, for protecting their reputations. And the approach that they hit on was to develop their own labor standards. They couldn't deny responsibility. Instead, they publicly accepted responsibility. They said, look, we get the fact that it's our products being made in these factories. We now commit ourselves to ensure that these factories respect internationally recognized worker rights. They adopted their own codes of conduct, which generally require compliance with local law and certain international standards, and they established so-called monitoring programs, factory inspection systems, where the brands and retailers themselves would send inspectors into the factories to ensure that the factories were respecting the rights and the safety of workers. Again, the governments weren't enforcing the law, so the brands essentially took responsibility for doing so themselves. Now, there are a broad range of these kinds of monitoring programs. All the big brands and retailers have their own in-house programs. Some of the smaller ones use contractors, and then there are various organizations in which the brands and retailers participate that also do this work. Some have NGOs also involved, but they're generally funded and controlled by the brands. There are certification bodies funded by the brands where a factory can actually get a certificate that says it is a safe and responsible employer. The result is that virtually every garment factory producing for export to North America and Europe is inspected numerous times every year by inspectors representing the brands and retailers. Nonetheless, even though there are vast numbers of inspections of factories year after year, including inspections focused on the issue of workplace safety, of the 4 worst factory disasters in the 200-year history of mechanized apparel production, 3 have occurred in the last 2.5 years. The Ali Enterprises fire in September of 2012 in Pakistan, the worst factory fire in the history of the garment industry, 289 dead. Tazreen Fashions fire, November of 2012 in Bangladesh, the 3rd worst fire in the history of the global garment industry, 112 killed. And of course, the Rana Plaza building collapse, the worst disaster in any factory, in any industry, in the history of factories. 1,137 workers died in the building collapse. The 4th worst disaster was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, March 25th, 1911 in Manhattan. 146 workers, mostly young women, killed. So why is it that we are seeing in the 21st century a level of catastrophe for workers in the garment industry that we hadn't seen since 2011, even though we have these corporate social responsibility programs bringing about inspections in all of the factories? And I'm going to answer that question in the context of what's taken place in Bangladesh. So very quickly, background on Bangladesh, working conditions in the industry there, which is the 2nd largest garment industry now globally after China, close to $24 billion in exports at factory price, about $100 billion at retail. Wages now are 31 cents an hour. That's the minimum which most workers receive. There's a 48-hour statutory work week, 6 8-hour days, but most workers work more like 60 or 70, whether they want to or not. Very harsh treatment of workers by supervisors who believe that the way you get workers to work more quickly and more efficiently is to pressure, humiliate, and threaten them. Almost no unions, not because workers don't seek to organize, they do all the time, but almost invariably the leaders of those organizing drives are fired. And most importantly for our purposes, a near total disregard for the safety of workers, despite the fact that the country has a perfectly good national building code, which addresses fire safety issues, electrical safety, building safety, and has been on the books and carried the force of law for decades. Unfortunately, this building code is, for all intents and purposes, a compelling work of fiction. It's got nothing to do with the way factories have been built and the way that they are operated. The result is that in Bangladesh, unsafe factories are the norm. The factories have no fire exits. And I'm going to talk in a minute about what I mean by that, because it's important to understand it from a technical standpoint. It is often the case that doors on the exit routes that people would use to escape a burning building are locked. Weak and unreliable emergency lighting, antiquated alarm systems, substandard wiring, combined with improper storage of cloth, which is how you get fires in the first place. Sparks, piles of cloth, you get fires. And finally, serious structural flaws. Construction of buildings done without permits, additional stories added onto buildings years after the original construction without any effort to actually strengthen the foundation on the columns despite the added weight, and insufficient column strength in many buildings. This is the Rana Plaza building before the building collapsed. You'll notice the 3 stories at the top of the building. Those were added after the original construction with no attempt to increase the strength of the columns or the foundation, and that's why the building collapsed. 1,137 dead, as I mentioned. Fire safety. So this is a schematic of a typical factory. On the right side is the stairwell that you would use to exit this multi-story building. On the left side is the production space in the building. This is a properly designed building, and the critical point to note here is that there is physical separation between the stairwell and the rest of the building. Why is this important? Because in a fire in a multi-story building, what matters more than anything else by far is the ability of workers to get down the stairs and get out of the building. What this separation does, this is construction that will keep smoke and heat out of the stairwell for a period of time. This keeps the stairwell clear of smoke, makes it feasible to get out. In addition, when you don't have this kind of separation, not only do the stairwells become impassable because they quickly fill with smoke, and of course these fires burn very hot and very fast, but the stairwell itself becomes a conduit to distribute the deadly smoke to the rest of the factory. So if you have a fire on the first floor, the smoke flows into the stairwells, up to the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor, and all of a sudden everyone's life is in danger. But even though the smoke now is on the fourth and fifth floor, workers on that floor, those floors can't get out because they don't have a clear stairwell. This is a 2-dimensional representation of the same essential point. You see the separated stairwell on the right side. One other critical factor is when you get to the bottom of the stairwell, you want to have a door there that leads outside the building to a place of safety. You don't want to have to walk to the ground floor and then cross the ground floor to get out of the building because the ground floor itself may be on fire. Garment factories in Bangladesh do not have these kinds of fire exits. They do not have this physical separation between the stairwells and the floor, even though this is in the building code, and indeed in every building code in every country in the world. This is how people get out of burning multi-story buildings, through fire separation and properly designed fire exits. Instead, what you have in Bangladesh are these gates. And as you can see, this gate is not going to keep smoke out of the stairwell. The stairwell's on the right, the production floor is on the left. These kinds of open stairwells are the norm throughout the industry. Indeed, prior to 2013, we're unaware of any factory in Bangladesh that had properly designed fire exits. So what happens when you get a fire in these buildings is that the smoke fills the stairwells, flows to the rest of the building, and people can't get out. Tazreen Fashions, November of 2012. You'll see here, this is the main stairwell of the building looking down from the top. It's going to be a little hard to see because it's a little bright in here. Can we get some of the lights off? So if you look up on the top right of the frame, that is the space between the stairwell and the production area on that floor. And as you'll see, it's one of these accordion gates. And that was the case throughout the building. This is the bottom floor of the factory. The fire was on the bottom floor. This is the stairwell going up. You see it's completely unseparated. What you'll also notice is when you get to the bottom of that stairwell, there's no door outside. You have to cross the entire floor to the other side to get out, which means you would have had to somehow be able to walk safely through flames, which, as you know, human beings can't do. So the result was that after the fire started in this building, some workers got out quickly before the smoke spread, but as soon as it did, it was impossible. After that point, most people who got out did so by leaping out of the third, fourth, and fifth story windows. Some survived, some died in the fall. 112 people killed in total. And that's not the only time this has happened. Just one other example, December 2010, a factory producing for many major US brands and retailers, fire on the second to highest floor, filled the stairwell. People couldn't get down from the top floor. Many of the workers who survived did so because some workers tied together bolts of denim. They were sewing jeans for Gap. They tied together these bolts to make these 80-foot ropes, and then people were able to climb down, but some fell off as they were trying to climb down the building. 29 dead in that building, and there have been many, many other fires. So why is it then that we have these mass fatality incidents in Bangladesh despite the CSR inspection programs that I was speaking of earlier? And this is the most important question, I think, for us to try to address today. Is it the case that the factories where workers died were not inspected? No. In fact, every one of the factories where workers have died en masse in Bangladesh was repeatedly inspected by brands and retailers. Just a few quick examples. Tazreen Fashions, repeatedly inspected by Walmart, which was the biggest buyer. 5 factories were in the Rana Plaza building that collapsed. Children's Place, the largest U.S. children's clothing retailer, repeatedly inspected at Loblaw, one of the largest apparel retailers in Canada. BSCI, one of these certification bodies, all had inspected those factories. Garib & Garib, another factory that burned in 2010, 21 dead, repeatedly inspected by the largest customer of that factory, H&M. The factory I just mentioned that burned in 2010, producing for Gap, PVH, which owns Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein, Target, all had inspected the factory repeatedly. So it wasn't that these factories weren't inspected. In fact, Ali Enterprises, the worst garment factory fire in the history of the industry, 289 dead, was certified by an organization called Social Accountability International, the most respected of these industry-funded certification bodies, was certified 3 weeks before the fire as a safe and responsible employer. Is it the case that the brands and retailers were unaware of the dangers in these factories? The answer to that question is also no. They had ample warning, because in Bangladesh there was disaster after disaster after disaster, and this is just a list of some of the worst ones dating back to 2000. Indeed, in 2005, there was another building collapse that killed 73 people. This is the building after the collapse. The biggest customer of that factory was a company called Inditex, which owns Zara, and is now the world's largest fashion retailer. In 2005 and 2006 alone, there were 7 different mass fatality disasters that killed in the aggregate more than 200 workers. So the brands were exquisitely well aware of the risks that existed. Is it the case that these brands and retailers don't understand how to make an apparel factory safe? I'm sure you know the answer to that question is no, because we've understood for close to 100 years the fundamentals of building safety in a multi-story industrial structure. And indeed, these fundamentals of building safety are reflected in the building codes of all relevant countries, including Bangladesh. All the brands and retailers had to do was read the Bangladesh National Building Code. So none of these reasons can possibly explain the failure. Indeed, all of the factories where workers have died en masse were repeatedly inspected by brands and retailers who were well aware of the risks and well aware of the measures needed to make an apparel factory safe. So what the hell happened? Here's what happened. The brands and retailers never told their inspectors even to look at the key issues that were killing workers. The inspectors never checked to see if the factories had proper fire exits, if the stairwells were separated so they would remain passable in a fire, and they never asked them to see whether the structural integrity of the building was sound. The 2 issues, the 2 hazards that were killing workers year after year, lack of proper fire exits, weak physical structures, were never part of the brand's inspection programs. And this is not just one brand or retailer. None of the brands or retailers ever asked inspectors to look at these questions. How is that possible? Why would you send inspectors into factories knowing that the biggest hazards threatening the lives of workers are lack of fire exits and lack of sufficient structural strength, and not ask your inspectors to look at those questions? How can CSR programs possibly function in this manner? The reason is that the purpose of corporate social responsibility programs is not to protect workers. That is not what they are designed to do. Labor rights abuses in these global supply chains create 2 different sets of problems. They create a problem for workers that we all understand: dangerous and degrading working conditions combined with poverty wages. But they create another problem, which is the reputational risk we spoke about for brands and retailers. And it's crucial to understand these are 2 separate, related but separate problems. The brands and retailers naturally are concerned about their problem, the potential damage to their image and reputation of being associated with these abusive conditions. And they will therefore naturally try to find a way to solve that problem. And because of the nature of corporations, which are profit-maximizing entities, they want to minimize cost and maximize revenue, they will look for the least expensive possible way to solve their problem, the risk to the image and reputation. If brands and retailers were to actually take the steps necessary to really improve working conditions and wages in these supply chains, you would get modest but significant increases in costs, and you'd have slower delivery. You can't force workers to work overnight. When the order is late, delivery is slower. You have to invest in expensive equipment, health and safety equipment. Costs rise. The cheapest way, as it turned out, for brands and retailers to solve their problem was to create factory inspection programs that gave the appearance of a great deal of earnest effort by the brands and retailers to protect the rights and safety of workers, but did not, in fact, require them to make fundamental changes in the labor practices of their contractors. That's a lot cheaper way to do it, and indeed, that is what has happened. It's worth asking, what would have happened if the inspectors had been told to focus on the issue of fire exits and unsound structures? Well, they would have had to come back to the brands and retailers in every factory with respect to fire safety and said, these factories need to install fire exits. This is a process that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. What are the brands and retailers then going to do? Well, they could leave the factory, but where are they going to go? Because every other factory has the same problem. They could leave Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is the cheapest place to produce and therefore very attractive. The only alternative they would have had would have been to actually help invest in making the factories safer. The factory owners, by and large, can't afford it. They're operating on tiny margins in the context of this enormous competitive pressure. The only way to address the issue would have been for the brands and retailers to help pay to make the factories safe. There would have been production slowdowns. So the brands and retailers never asked them to take these steps that would have forced the hand of the brands and retailers in terms of the reforms that were needed in the industry. Instead, they told them to count fire extinguishers. And if there weren't enough fire extinguishers, then you get a couple more fire extinguishers, which is nice. It's good to have fire extinguishers, but any fire safety expert will tell you that the importance of fire extinguishers is minimal relative to the importance of being able to get out of a burning building alive. And so the brands simply never addressed these issues until the Rana Plaza building collapse and the weeks of sustained global media coverage that followed it radically increased the reputational risk for the brands. And at that point, it proved possible for the first time for our organization and a number of others working on this to get a large number of brands and retailers to sign an agreement that obligates them to help pay to make the factories in Bangladesh safe. And what distinguishes that agreement from the CSR programs that the brands and retailers themselves have created is that unlike the brands and retailers programs, the Bangladesh agreement does not involve self-policing. Again, the brands programs are created by the brands, operated by the brands. They involve no enforceable commitment to any third party. The Bangladesh agreement, known as the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, is a binding contract between the brands and retailers and labor unions. The brands inspection programs historically have had no transparency. Even the workers never see the inspectors' reports. Under the Accord, all the inspection reports are public. The brands, in order to make it affordable to go into all these factories, because they want to say they're inspecting every factory, hired people with no particular technical background and trained them to do everything. Audit the payroll, inspect for fire safety, and 40 different other things, which means no one with real fire safety expertise, for example, ever walked into the factory. And as I noted, under the brands programs, problems that were widespread and expensive to fix were largely ignored. Under the Accord, those problems are the focus of the agreement. So we have a binding agreement between unions and brands and retailers under which they're obligated to pay to make the factories safe, backed up by enforceability of the brand's commitments and public transparency. And we see this as a model for how to address labor rights abuses on issues across the board in countries across the world. We want to see a major shift from the CSR programs of the brands and retailers to binding enforceable agreements that will actually protect the rights and safety of workers. And although it's a very difficult battle and an uphill battle, I'm increasingly optimistic that we're going to see more and more progress toward that goal, in part because it's very hard in the wake of what happened in Bangladesh for the brands to credibly claim that their CSR programs are working. Thank you.
So how's it going in Bangladesh? I mean, are people getting are the factories safe? Are wages up? How's progress?
Well, I mean, the agreement focuses on the safety issues.
Okay.
And the buildings are getting fixed. But it is, and I'm sure this won't be a surprise to anyone, a challenge to enforce the agreement for the same reasons that brands and retailers didn't want to sign it in the first place, which is that there are real costs involved. But the buildings are, in most cases, getting fixed. Fire exits are getting installed. In many cases, there are structural enhancements being made. About 25 buildings had to be shut down temporarily because the structural weakness was so extreme that any of those factories could have collapsed on any given day. So that's moving forward, but it is a challenge to get the brands to do what they're supposed to be doing, particularly to pay for the renovations where the factory owners need help. There's a whole other piece of the program that has to do with the creation of worker-led health and safety committees in every factory. That's just beginning. There's also been, apart from the agreement, some progress in Bangladesh on the right to organize. About 4% of the factories are now unionized, but we're also seeing an increasing backlash from employers in the form of physical violence against trade union leaders. And so it's an ongoing struggle in Bangladesh, but certainly more progress in the last 2 years than had ever previously been seen.
So you focused on the safety issue here. Can we just briefly sort of give a picture of the working beyond that, the compensation issues like health coverage, wages, just a broad picture of that.
Right. Well, as I said, the wage now in Bangladesh for garment workers is 31 cents an hour. That's up from 18 cents an hour 2 years ago and 11 cents an hour 2 years before that. It's the lowest garment wage in the world except for Burma, which has no minimum wage at all. And it's a joke of a wage. I mean, workers cannot pay rent. They can't feed their kids on that wage. Even after the increases, there's still a huge problem with long hours of excessive overtime, which is involuntary, even though the law requires that it be voluntary. As I mentioned, there's a very harsh management culture. I mean, this is true of the industry in general, particularly in Bangladesh, a tremendously cruel approach by managers to pressuring workers to work more quickly and more efficiently. And the only way most of those issues are going to get addressed is through unionization.
Could you, Alta Gracia was mentioned before, and you've told me this story, and so I think it's a really fascinating story. And could you, kind of briefly, we don't have that much time,
Sure.
but tell that story.
This is a factory in the Dominican Republic that, among other things, is committed to paying a genuine living wage to workers. And depending, of course, on how you define living wage, in general, a living wage is several multiples of the prevailing wage for garment workers in a given country. In the Dominican Republic, the living wage, as we calculated, is about 3.25 times the minimum wage. And this is the only factory we know of in the global south producing for export to the United States where workers are actually paid a living wage. The factory was opened pursuant to an agreement between ourselves, an apparel brand called Knight's Apparel, which is now owned by Hanes Brands, and the Dominican Labor Union Federation that we've worked with there for years. And it's one small factory. There are 150 workers. But the purpose of the project was to demonstrate that it is possible to make apparel at decent wages under decent working conditions. There is a cost impact. At factory price, garments cost about 20% more than they would if they were made under traditional conditions at traditional wages in the Dominican Republic. But for 20% more, and that's factory price, which doesn't necessarily have to translate to a 20% increase at retail price, given the size of markups. For 20% at factory price, of course, we would argue that's a reasonable price to pay to have wages workers can actually feed and support and raise their families on in conditions that are decent and safe, as opposed to the sweatshop reality for most workers globally. And our hope is that that model will be one that will help us generate pressure on brands and retailers for broader change.
What do they like? What do they make? Is that it's all university?
It is right now almost exclusively university logo T-shirts and sweatshirts sold at campus stores across the country, including here at UNH. And the program has been embraced by Barnes & Noble, which operates the UNH store, and many other campus stores, by its main competitor, a bookstore company called Follett. Some universities still operate their own stores, and many of those have supported it. There is a hope to expand the product to other retail streams as well.
And one last question before I open it up. a little bit more about the worker rights, what your role in all of this is, and I briefly alluded to how you were created, but like your governance structure, what are you a consortium of? A little bit more on that, I think, would be interesting.
The WRC has 175 colleges and universities as affiliates, and our
which UNH is one.
Of which UNH is one, and our good part of our day-to-day work is monitoring compliance with labor standards that universities have adopted at the urging of students that apply to their licensing deals with Nike and Adidas and many dozens of other companies that make university logo sweatshirts, T-shirts, and other clothing. And those labor codes are different from the CSR programs in the industry in that they're not voluntary. They are mandatory on the brands and retailers. Nike is contractually obligated to meet the labor standards of the universities whose clothing it produces. If it doesn't do that, it can have its license to make that clothing taken away. And we monitor compliance. At the same time, we recognize that although that monitoring is an effective tool in some cases to help workers eliminate abuses and improve conditions, that the dynamics that define the industry, which I described early in my talk, are the real driver of the problem, and until and unless they can be addressed at a systemic level, the prospect of genuine, broad, and sustainable compliance won't exist. And so in addition to that day-to-day work, both at university factories and at non-university factories, we've also increasingly focused on seeking opportunities to promote systemic change, and this work in Bangladesh is an example of that.
Okay, and just, what's your structure? Who controls you?
It's a tripartite board structure. There are 5 university representatives, 5 elected by United Students Against Sweatshops, which is the national student anti-sweatshop organization, and 5 people from a labor rights advisory council made up of academics and people from civil society who have relevant expertise. The money, the universities pay as an obligation of their affiliation 1% of their annual licensing revenue, the money they make from their licensing deals with the apparel brands, which will generate this year for us about $1.3 million.
Doing a lot with it.
Yeah, and if the University of Michigan would get its act together at football, it would be higher.
Yeah, you'd once told me it depends a lot on how the big
Well, I can't watch
schools.
any basketball or football game anymore without calculating in my head the impact on our revenues, because the better the team does, the more sweatshirts people buy and the more money we get. And then we also raise money, of course, from traditional nonprofit sources, foundations, to some extent from government sources, including the U.S. government.
Okay, so let's open up for questions. I think there's a mic. Amy has a microphone that she is going to. Kurt has a question.
I was just curious to follow up on that. How do you actually monitor? How do you assess the compliance with these agreements?
Well, we have representatives in 8 countries who are permanent representatives of the organization, and then we have occasional consultants in about another dozen countries, and they conduct factory-specific investigations, the most important part of which is interviews with workers, which are almost invariably conducted off-site, away from the factory. We identify workers through local organizations that workers trust, and then interview them in places where they're comfortable talking. This is in contrast to what the industry inspectors do, which is talk to workers inside the factory in an office provided by management. And they've gotten a little better at how they do that, but you can still imagine how in many cases workers would not be totally comfortable talking candidly under those circumstances, particularly if they have something negative to say. And then, of course, we also visit the factories, interview managers, review documents. Our investigations are complaint-driven. We know that the problems are widespread. We know that we cannot have broad change, that the factories won't actually be broadly in compliance with university codes until the industry changes. So in the university work, we try to focus limited resources on the most egregious cases, which means we're responding to complaints from workers about particularly serious problems at factories. So our investigations are also targeted at the particular issue that workers have raised, rather than going through a checklist of labor rights concerns. And then we issue quite detailed reports on the inspections. And the other way in which we differ from the industry approach is if we've identified violations at a factory, and frankly, if we're going there, we usually do, because there usually are violations, we're committed to working with the workers, with a union if there is one, with the brands that use the factory, with the factory management. Sometimes we're working on the factory management for as long as it takes to get the issues addressed. We don't issue a report, disappear for a year, and then go back and see if miraculously everything got fixed. We remain engaged week after week, month after month, which is often what it takes, because a lot of pressure needs to be brought to bear to get factories to make changes that are going to cost them money.
And let me just, a question. Do the agreements, there's health and safety rules, but is it also compensation, wages, and is that?
Most of what the university codes do, and most of what the brand's own codes do, is incorporate by reference the domestic law of the country in question. And with some exceptions, the domestic law is usually pretty strong. You know, these are largely post-colonial and/or post-revolutionary societies in which the original government that came into power passed all sorts of strong, progressive labor law. It's just that they're not, by and large, enforced. So usually what the codes really do in practice is say the factory must comply with the law. Now, there are some areas where law on paper is deficient relative to international standards. In China and Vietnam, for example, it's illegal to have an independent labor union. So the code requires that even if the national law falls short. And there are some other areas where international standards are especially relevant. But by and large, it's just telling the factory, obey the law.
So so the wage requirement is minimum wage.
The minimum wage. Now, there are some university codes that have a living wage or some variant. Fair wage is a term that's used as part of the code. But as we've informed universities from the outset, the only way to enforce that standard is to get the brands and retailers to pay significantly higher prices to the factories and to consolidate production. Because even if you can get one brand to pay 20% more, if they only represent 8% of the factory's output, that's obviously not enough additional revenue to spread major raises across the board. Alta Gracia is set up as an experiment in how to do that. So many universities actually have a living wage standard, but it's unenforceable unless we can get the brands and retailers to fundamentally change the way that they organize their supply chains and the prices they pay for apparel, which we would like to see universities do. But that's, of course, a huge battle because it's the last thing the brands want to do.
When you go in places, sometimes it is about wages. They're not even paying the minimum wage.
Often. We've had a project for the last 2 years in Haiti where there's been systemic violation of the minimum wage law and have been trying to pressure brands and retailers and factory owners just to start paying the minimum wage with some success, but even that's an ongoing battle. And there's always some excuse, some loophole in the law that people point to, some tortured interpretation of what the minimum wage really is, and that's the case in Haiti. But in the end, it's just about finding ways to cheat workers.
Hi. I love what your consortium is doing, but I am concerned that workers' rights and safety is prevalent in our country as well, not only in sweatshops, but, for example, the coal industry. So I was just wondering if you see your consortium expanding to other industries beyond the sweatshops and potentially in our country.
Yeah, and we do, of course, some work in the U.S. because there's still some apparel production in the U.S., and we do some work in other sectors. For example, we have a contract now with the U.S. Department of Labor to enforce a consent decree designed to address wage and hour violations at a healthcare facility in Northern California. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to help the Department of Labor improve its approach to compliance monitoring, because their traditional approach has been to let the employer that's had to agree to correct violations actually pick the monitor who's going to monitor whether the employer is doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is obviously not an effective model. But for us, the key issue is leverage, right? There's no point in doing investigations of any factory, in any industry, in any country, if you do not have the leverage you would need to compel the factory owner to actually end whatever abuses you're able to uncover. In the apparel sector, we have leverage through the universities and through some other means. We're very eager to find more leverage in more sectors. We're doing more work now on electronics. There's a big push in Europe to get European governments that buy computers and other electronics to condition those purchases on labor rights performance, and there's a possibility that we'll be able to work with groups there with real leverage to try to force some changes in the electronics sector, although that's hugely difficult in part because almost all the production is in China. So I share your desire to see these issues addressed in multiple industries and specifically in the US, but the big question is, where do you find the leverage to compel the employers to change their practices?
You mentioned that this whole bill was passed in response to the Rana Plaza disaster. Do you think that it created a shift in attitude amongst corporations to be preventative, or do you think it's still going to be reactionary in an uphill battle?
Right. Well, the concept predates Rana Plaza. The first company that signed the agreement was PVH, which, as I mentioned, owns Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger. That was in 2012. We just didn't have enough leverage until Rana Plaza scared the hell out of the brands to actually get large numbers of companies to sign it. And even then, most of the biggest U.S. brands and retailers refused to sign and created their own much more voluntary program. So you ask a good question, did it really change attitudes? I don't think so. It did force the brands and retailers to reassess the level of reputational risk they face in Bangladesh. They never anticipated something like Rana Plaza. Again, there had been numerous mass fatality incidents, but none of those incidents ever generated enough sustained press coverage to pose real risk of serious reputational damage to the brands. Rana Plaza did that, and they've had to reassess. So certainly in Bangladesh, they're more attuned to the safety issues, even if they're not part of our agreement than they originally were. But in terms of fundamental change in attitude, no. I mean, my experience dealing with brands and retailers is that they go exactly as far as they're forced to go. It's unfortunate, but that's the practical reality that we've encountered in case after case. You know, there aren't moral epiphanies in corporate boardrooms. They don't suddenly decide that they're going to dedicate themselves to the betterment of workers. They view the labor rights issues as an issue of reputational risk management, and they may adjust the way they manage that risk as they have in Bangladesh, but in terms of a fundamental change in approach, no, at least not so far. And I should stress just one point. You know, it was a fairly brief presentation, or at least it probably didn't seem that brief to all of you, but it felt brief to me. But, you know, in saying that these CSR programs are designed to protect the brands, not the workers, I don't want to imply that there was some grand conspiracy at the time that these programs were created. The brands and retailers had to take responsibility and say that they were going to monitor and try to protect workers. They needed to do that to protect the reputation of the brand. Having done so, they adopted codes and hired monitors and sent people out. Those people went out. You have to think about the way those programs developed over time. What happened to the monitors who went back to the brands and said, this factory is a disaster, you should leave? What happened to monitors who said that over and over and over again? What happened when the monitors found a serious problem, told the factory to fix it? The factory called up the brand and said, I'd like to fix this, but I need a 10% price increase. What happened in case after case after case, not by design, but because of the day-to-day priorities of the brands and the realities of the industry, is that the brands followed the path of least resistance again and again. Where something was expensive to fix, it didn't get fixed. Those monitors who were too candid about what they were finding didn't get hired to do monitoring anymore. And so over time, you got a system that developed that was pretty good at protecting brand reputations by creating the appearance of a lot of earnest activity to address worker rights issues, but where the key issues again and again and again simply got ignored because the brands and retailers were not willing to pay to fix those problems. And if we have more time, we could talk more about the complicated political and economic dynamics that turned what was supposed to be a labor rights program into a glorified and highly sophisticated public relations exercise. I just wanted to be clear that I'm not suggesting all the CEOs got together and said, let's create fake CSR programs. They just became fake because of the overriding priorities of the companies as institutions and the dynamics of the garment industry.
Thank you. So two questions, but they're related. So you mentioned the need for more systemic change. And I'm interested in hearing more about that. What kind of systemic change? And also, what is the role of public policy in enhancing that leverage or in adding to that systemic change?
What we want to see is the brands operate their supply chains in a way that makes it actually possible for the factories to meet the labor standards the brands themselves say they want the factories to meet. So we want the brands not to pay prices to factories so low that the only way the factory can possibly meet the price is to ignore the labor standards. We want to see the brands accept the fact that it costs more to produce under good conditions than bad conditions, and to be willing, therefore, to adjust prices and the structure of the supply chain so that they take greater responsibility for each factory reward those factories that do the right thing, not just with higher prices, but with long-term commitments, and walk away from any factory that doesn't comply. Not a year later when it's no longer convenient to produce there, but tomorrow if need be. And indeed, we're dealing with that issue right now in Bangladesh. Under the agreement, if a factory refuses to renovate and become safe, the brand has to leave the factory. That's a radical departure from the norm in the industry where the brands want to have no such obligation because it may be very inconvenient to leave a given factory. We want the brands and retailers to have to leave if the factory is reckless, even if it's inconvenient to do so. We believe the only way we will get that is if we can compel brands and retailers to sign enforceable contracts with worker representatives that cover those issues in a broad sense. Now, the other way you might get there is through effective public regulation. The governments of countries like Bangladesh are not going to do it, in part because if they did, the brands and retailers would punish them by moving to another country. It could be done by governments in the apparel importing countries, including the United States. The United States could pass a law that said an importer, Nike, Walmart, whoever it is, may not import a product into the United States that is made under conditions that violate the domestic law of the country exporting it or applicable international standards. And it could attach that requirement to very stiff penalties. That would very radically change the way garments and any other goods subject to such a law are produced. But as you probably know, our global policy on trade and commerce has been moving radically in the other direction for many, many years, to the point where the U.S. is now part of international agreements under which that law would probably be, at least would be argued to be illegal in the first place. Fortunately, as you all know, such trivialities as international law don't stop the United States when it really decides it wants to do something. So if the United States wanted to enact such protections, it could do so and would do so. And that's what would really compel brands and retailers to change their behavior. But that would require a massive political movement in the U.S. Not because the idea isn't popular. If you conducted an opinion poll asking if we should have such laws, you'd probably get 90% of people saying yes, which is tough in U.S. opinion polling, right? I mean, if you ask people, will the sun rise tomorrow, you get about 86%. So it's widely popular. It's just, as you know, when it comes to international trade and commerce policy, it's not the will of the general public that largely influences the decision-making of elected officials. So you'd need a very strong and aggressive movement to compel elected officials to enact such a law. So it's, on the one hand, eminently possible to do it through public regulation, but it would require a major political transformation to get to a point where our government would actually enact such laws. And the same is true of the Canadian government and all of the relevant governments in the European Union.
So so one way that you could, the other approach to this is have consumers demand it, which is in effect what the reputational risk issue is, right? I mean, right. If that's what they're worried about is that that they're going to what they're doing is an affront to their customers.
Right. The problem, of course, is how do you mobilize massive numbers of consumers? I mean, the brands do believe that consumers will turn away from a brand if it's viewed as a bad actor. And one of the main weapons that advocacy groups have is to target a brand and convince that brand that they can educate people in a way that will actually cause consumers to turn away. But that's about the organizing work of the advocates. It's not about organizing consumers.
Your organization, in effect, is a product of that strategy in the sense of the universities being, in essence, consumers or
but the
having leverage.
Absolutely. And the way they differ, of course, is that they are institutional consumers. If you could organize 10 million consumers to make it painfully clear to H&M or Nike that if H&M or Nike doesn't clean up conditions in its factories, that they'll buy instead from Gap and Adidas, I agree that would be tremendously effective. The challenge, of course, is actually being able to organize people, particularly around that kind of issue.
So we're actually over time now. I first want to thank Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks. And second, say there is that we as consumers. Oh, let's do the raffle.
Yeah.
Got to do the raffle. But for those of you who are unfortunate enough not to win the raffle, we as consumers can make a statement by buying our UNH apparel or any other or most other university apparel from Alta Gracia, which shows that this experiment that, in fact, garments can be made in decent conditions with decent pay is actually a viable business strategy.
Right, and of course, the other thing you can do is join organizations like the Peace and Justice League and others
There you
that
go.
not only focus on buying the right thing, but also bring appropriate pressure to bear on key actors to do the right thing.
Scott's doing this.
I'm doing it.
Okay, that's good design. There's a hole in the bottom. And the winner is?
The winner is Miles Parker.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.